Hello, welcome to the channel Y Stories. Enjoy watching.
Forgetting his office keys, the surgeon returned home. As he quietly entered the hallway, he froze, hearing his wife and mother-in-law talking. Carlos Torres was a surgeon by the grace of God, and that said it all. It was his essence and his calling. Without it, he couldn't imagine himself. "I want to be a doctor, a surgeon," Carlos asserted from an early age. The profession was noble, but unfortunately, it was no longer as respected and lucrative as it once was. Moreover, no one in the family had any connection to medicine, so his parents were baffled by their son's choice. "Son, maybe you should think about it some more? The training is difficult and lengthy. Do you understand the prospects? Do you know what you'll have to face?" his mother lamented. "Yes, Carlos," his father questioned. "Perhaps you should choose something more traditional, an economist, a lawyer?" "I didn't choose. I know, I feel who I must be," their son insisted categorically. The teenager showed extraordinary persistence. The parents could only shrug. What could they do? It was his choice. Although, of course, they continued to worry and doubt between themselves. But Carlos had no doubts. He simply saw the goal and went for it. How could a boy, who had never been exposed to this specific world, have such determination? Only as he progressed through medical school, seeing their son's success and the light in his eyes, did the parents finally calm down, marveling at their son's wisdom and foresight. And Carlos, ignoring everything else, just pursued his dream. Yes, it was a long and thorny path, but the young man overcame it step by step. He had no anxiety or insecurity. That was the most important thing. Even seasoned professors, with extensive practical experience, admired his talent during practical sessions, his way of handling a scalpel, his knowledge, his composure, his ability to control the entire staff in the operating room, albeit a training one. All indicated that they were witnessing a future outstanding surgeon. Having completed his university path, internship, and becoming a resident allowed to perform independent surgeries, Carlos was infinitely happy. He saw his work not as routine and obligation, but as a celebration, a way of self-discovery day by day. The young surgeon's entire life was dedicated to his profession, and every patient was critically important to him. Carlos Torres strove to do his best for each patient, regardless of his fatigue, chronic sleep deprivation, and terrible workload. He saw it as his duty and couldn't do otherwise. His life routine consisted only of endless work. There was no place for even a modicum of rest or self-pity, as so many people needed help. Carlos was passionate about his work and at work. It was the meaning of his existence. The gratitude of recovering patients and their relatives knew no bounds. Everyone saw this dedication of the young surgeon from the outside. Even the usually cynical junior and middle medical staff treated him with respect and admiration. Polite, intelligent, and fair, the man was well liked by everyone. But everything has a flip side. Naturally, such a dedicated approach primarily affected other aspects of life. First and foremost, it hit his personal sphere. Carlos simply didn't have the physical capability to devote enough time to his family. He couldn't be in two places at once. There was work, which took up an enormous amount of time, and he needed to sleep, and that basically exhausted his day. This couldn't help but cause dissatisfaction in his wife. Regina constantly confronted him, demanding attention and care. Carlos sincerely didn't understand these complaints. He had always been honest that work was his top priority. He never built rosy castles in the air, promising to be home by 6 p.m. That was simply impossible. He thought Regina should have understood the rules of the game from the very beginning. It seemed she accepted them when she agreed to be his wife, to go through life with him, to be his reliable support. But, as often happens, the young woman overestimated her strength. She wasn't ready to become the classic wife who silently waits for her husband by the window. His work annoyed her, infuriated her, and his absence at home, those endless patients he couldn't get away from, was a constant source of frustration. Regina genuinely didn't understand why her husband didn't move to a private clinic. He had so many lucrative offers. There would be less work, a much higher salary. Who turns down such conditions? But Carlos was that kind of person. He stubbornly refused to consider any offers, remaining loyal to his native hospital. All these marital quarrels felt like beating a dead horse. What could he argue? He had explained hundreds of times why he acted the way he did. He simply couldn't do otherwise. His wife didn't understand and kept complaining. Low pay, too much work, no time, and the list went on and on. What could he say? Guilty. But Carlos couldn't change himself, while his wife didn't relent and kept nagging him tirelessly. How long will this continue? Regina exclaimed yet again. When will I ever mean anything to you? It seems I need to end up on your operating table for that to happen. Please, enough with the dramatics, Carlos resisted wearily. This will continue for my entire life, and I honestly warned you from the start. Work comes first. Yes, that's how it was and will be for me. I was a fool in love, that's why I agreed. If only you brought decent money into the family, but this. Who needs all this? Regina, I need it like air, you understand? I can't live without it. Then go to a private clinic, operate, be a surgeon. Just fewer hours and for more money, his wife retorted without missing a beat. We're going around in circles again. You don't understand me, I'm tired, enough. Carlos looked at his watch in horror. I have to get up in 4 hours. Sorry, we'll finish this later. It's always like this, Regina didn't relent, there's never any time for me. He once again left the battlefield at home, broken and weakened. These arguments and quarrels only drained his energy. It was as if Regina recharged from shouting, while it exhausted him. A couple of years ago, his wife added another grievance to her constant reproaches. She wanted to have a child and was adamant about it. Carlos asked her to wait, believing it wasn't the right time. He was focused on his career and wanted to become the head of the department. After all, having children wasn't urgent, there was still time. In principle, Carlos loved children and would be happy to have them, but he reasonably questioned the purpose of having them if he wouldn't be able to see them. He simply didn't have the resources to raise a child. I'm not 16, you know, his wife shouted. When am I supposed to have a child? At 40, when you're done playing surgeon. I think you're dramatizing. You're only 32, he countered. What's the rush? I want a child, Regina insisted. And I'm not against it, but not here and not now. Do you want to raise the child alone? I think it will lead to new conflicts. You'll be endlessly dissatisfied that I'm not spending enough time with the baby, and yes, that's how it will be. How else can it be when I sleep only 5 hours a day? Carlos, as best he could, appealed to logic and common sense. Will it ever be different? His wife asked through tears. Will anything ever change? I don't know, the surgeon admitted honestly. I can only speak about what's happening now. Regina would leave for the bedroom in a huff, feeling that her husband was guilty of all mortal sins, believing she did everything for him. And him? From Carlos's perspective, he didn't see himself as the perfect husband, of course not, but he was honest with his wife, tried to explain his position, his truth, but all to no avail. It was the eternal conflict, who was right and who was wrong, with each having their own viewpoint, their own vision. Worst of all, Regina's mother, Senora Marissa, always took her side. Her relationship with Carlos was very complicated. She didn't even try to hide her antipathy. Why bother with politeness? She spoke her mind directly, usually hurling accusations while defending her daughter. In her mother's eyes, Regina was always right. Any encounter between Carlos and his mother-in-law would immediately turn into an argument. They simply couldn't speak calmly to each other. The only solace was that Carlos worked constantly, so he saw her less. She was almost always at their home, apparently providing moral support and caring for her daughter. Fortunately, his parents didn't interfere, didn't try to openly assert their opinions, otherwise, it would have been complete chaos. This infuriated him. He couldn't understand why his mother-in-law was always hanging around, constantly meddling in their family. Was this normal? They lived separately. Why come over and try to establish her own rules, give advice, and comment on everything? Undoubtedly, Regina enabled this behavior, as she wouldn't make a move without her mother. So, while Carlos's career was on track with promising prospects, his personal life was falling apart. He had no answer, no solution. His parents somehow managed to get along. It seemed his mother listened to his father and could put herself in his shoes. Why couldn't Regina do the same? Who was to blame? These depressive thoughts increasingly consumed Carlos, and, to be honest, he even started contemplating divorce. The marriage completely failed to meet his expectations. What did Carlos hope for when he met Regina, fell in love, and proposed to her? He thought the girl would become his wife, his reliable support, that he would hurry home because his beloved would be waiting for him. But what was the reality? On the contrary, he increasingly stayed overnight at the hospital, in his office, even when there was no professional necessity. He didn't want to go home and listen to the same complaints over and over, or worse, meet with his mother-in-law. Looking at such a prospect, it was much better to have a meal in the local cafeteria and sleep on an uncomfortable couch. At least his nerves would be intact. Carlos thought about how he had to operate the next morning, interact with patients and their relatives. How long would he last if he kept shaking his nerves even more? And to be honest, almost all of his colleagues were divorced. Apparently, family ties simply cannot withstand such work, this frantic pace of life. Even the most understanding and patient gave up. And Regina, let's face it, by nature was not an understanding and patient wife. She had little empathy or sympathy, and worse, they spoke different languages. How many thousands of times had he tried to explain his truth to her, why he didn't want to leave the city hospital and move to the private sector? But no, his wife either didn't understand or didn't want to understand him at all, parroting the same thing, less work, more money, without trying to grasp that for him, it wasn't a plus. All this accumulated into endless negativity. Carlos was tired of coming home to receive a new portion of complaints and dissatisfaction. It was hard to remember a day when he and Regina peacefully talked, communicated on other topics, or discussed anything. Home was no longer a place of strength, a place where he could rest, and he already had endless stress. So what was the way out? One night, while on duty in the residence room, Carlos found himself alone with a colleague, the head of the trauma department. Lucas Rossetti was an experienced man, much older than the surgeon, and had recently divorced for the third time, but now he seemed very happy and content with life. The young colleague couldn't resist asking, eager to learn about someone else's experience and personal life. Carlos's question didn't surprise the traumatologist at all. Yeah, divorced again, the man cleared his throat, wanted a strong support system at home, but alas, it didn't work out again. And I fell for it, knowing it wouldn't work, but I still hoped. The young surgeon became even more saddened and concluded sadly, "It seems I'll have to go through this too. My marriage with Regina just isn't working out." Carlos expected support, understanding, thinking that if anyone, the seasoned and repeatedly unsuccessful traumatologist would surely understand. "Oh, stop it, rookie," Lucas waved him off. "You're both too young, that's why it isn't working out. Hormones are still raging and dictating behavior. Wait, give it time, maybe she'll calm down. She nags you, right?" Carlos only nodded in response. Of course. We all have the same problems, wives who have nothing to do with this profession, sitting at home and not understanding what their husbands do here, hence the constant quarrels. Do what you think is best, but I wouldn't be hasty if I were you. You'll regret it, obviously, unless things are really bad, if you're not at the end of your rope. Do you know what it's like to come home to an empty apartment after a shift, cook pasta for yourself, and that's if you even manage to buy it beforehand? Honestly, it's awful, makes you want to howl, Lucas sighed bitterly. He clearly got lost in his thoughts, recalling his own experiences. After a brief pause, he continued. And look at our chief, he's been married for 40 years. Can you imagine that? Yes, a saintly woman, very patient, Carlos said enviously. Try finding someone like Catalina nowadays. Oh, the traumatologist smirked, she was probably different when she was younger. Wisdom and patience don't come immediately. These qualities aren't typical of the young. In our youth, we're all maximalists, selfish, egocentric, focused only on our interests. That's normal. Over time, other qualities emerge. How old is your wife? 32, like me. She'll settle down. She's still young, too lively and proud. She'll calm down, grow out of it, Lucas tried to reassure him. Carlos wanted to believe his colleague was right, but his heart suggested otherwise. Maybe Regina would indeed become calmer, more patient, and wiser with age, listen to her husband, and respect him. But would they last until that bright moment? It seemed unlikely. One of them might just not withstand the current situation and drop out. Carlos wanted to believe he could overcome himself, be smarter, rise above all this. But he had less and less hope. Unfortunately, the next day at home brought another disappointment, confirming all his saddest and most troubling thoughts. Regina, unfortunately, was in a terrible mood, and the ensuing argument was beyond imagination. Carlos stoically listened to all his wife's complaints, silently nodding, trying not to get worked up, but his wife's anger only intensified in response to his passive reaction. And damn it, how to behave if he shouted, it would enrage her, and if he stayed silent, it would infuriate her even more. Exhausted from battling the incomprehensible, he practically begged for mercy. Regina, I beg you, let's leave this conversation for now. I have a terrible headache, and I haven't slept a single second. It's been a very tough day. I haven't slept for more than 30 hours. This plea was seen as cowardice by Regina, and he immediately paid for it. And do you think I'm not tired? I also work day and night, plus I have to constantly do the laundry, clean, and cook at home, like a hamster on a wheel. You only come home to sleep and then leave. His wife ranted and raved, and his words only triggered a new tirade. I don't force you to do the housework. I load my own clothes into the washing machine, hang them up myself. I eat in the cafeteria. Again, it was all in vain. His wife twisted his words. So you're accusing me of being a bad housewife? Oh God, Regina, what is it? Where did I say that? Carlos finally lost his temper and protested. I was just stating that I try not to burden you with all the household chores and do what I can myself. But who was listening to him? After so many years, he should have been used to his words being twisted and taken out of context. I should have kept quiet. Why did I even try? He scolded himself internally. I just gave her more fuel for her complaints and yelling. Regina was consistent. The topics had long been set. She complained about how everything annoyed her, that they were always short on money, and that Carlos was never around. He was fed up with it, the same thing over and over. He didn't want to argue, even though he had counter-arguments. How were they short on money? They lived in their own apartment, nicely renovated, debt-free, able to afford many things. From his perspective, there was no reason to complain, but his wife saw things differently. To her, everything seemed bleak, and she voiced her grievances. This angered him even more than the yelling. He saw people who truly had it tough, who faced real problems and genuine hardships. Compared to that, Regina's constant dissatisfaction seemed insulting to others. It was as if she lived in a different world. Regina always looked upwards, seeing what she lacked for happiness, what she didn't have that others did. Carlos saw things from a different angle. He saw how much they had compared to others, understood how wealthy and happy they were. Complaining to God about their minor issues and another bout of accumulating seemed sinful to him. How could they understand each other? It was incomprehensible and impossible. Carlos was lost in his thoughts while his wife's tirade continued. He tried to detach himself and just nodded. What was the point in starting another argument when no one listened? Succumbing to emotions, he sometimes neglected reason but tried to keep himself in check. Luckily, Regina had her own errands. She had to stop her flow of negativity because she was running late. Only after she left could he breathe a sigh of relief, finally reach the bathroom, and head to bed. Yet, he was already worried about the evening and the night. How would they go? Would his wife start yelling again? How would she behave? If so, he would prefer to spend the night at work. Only the thought of the challenging surgeries scheduled for the next day made him stay home, at least while there was still hope of getting some sleep in a comfortable bed. Surprisingly, by the evening, everything seemed to have calmed down. Regina prepared dinner, and during the meal, they even had a casual conversation about trivial matters and news. Although everything seemed peaceful, Carlos still felt uneasy. It seemed to him that his wife was more nervous than usual, even though she was trying to hide her anxiety. This was tiring. Such behavior was very unlike her. If something troubled her, she usually talked about it nonstop, never hiding her emotions. It seemed Regina simply didn't know how to conceal her feelings. If it weren't for the fresh memory of the morning's grand quarrel, he would have asked her outright what was wrong. But not today, no. Despite his broken sleep during the day, he was exhausted. He didn't have the energy to listen to Regina for several more hours. If she doesn't want to talk now, she'll tell me later, he decided to himself. Everything else was within the realm of normal. There might have been some lingering awkwardness and tension, but it didn't erupt into open confrontation, which was a relief in itself. The couple went to bed early, seemingly just to end the day. In the morning, even though he had more than enough sleep, a rarity for a surgeon, Carlos still felt somewhat distracted, overwhelmed by a sense of melancholy and apathy. He knew perfectly well where these feelings stemmed from. His subconscious never stopped working, and the gears were always turning. Carlos began to fully contemplate the idea of divorce. Yesterday's argument had left its mark. It seemed to be the last straw. His patience had its limits. These endless disputes with Regina drained him of energy more than the most complex, multi-hour surgeries ever did. That meant something significant, especially since in surgeries, he was motivated by the end result. He saw the goal. But here, what was it all for? There was no love left. Everything had been killed, burnt out. Regina had achieved this, or perhaps he was also to blame for the failure of their marriage. Yes, surely he was. No one is completely innocent. After all, he was at least guilty of marrying someone who wasn't suited to him at all. With these thoughts, continuing to ponder them from all angles, he went about his usual routine. It wasn't until he arrived at work that Carlos realized he had forgotten his office keys at home. His mind had been elsewhere. Damn, he cursed aloud. No help for it, I'll have to go back. While he could have gotten a spare key to his office from security, the keys to his personal safe were only with him, and they were on the same ring. And he couldn't do without them. Today was the weekly surgical department meeting. Everything had aligned to leave him no choice but to go back, losing precious time. Muttering curses and angry at himself, he returned home outside of his usual hours. Naturally, it never occurred to him to notify his wife. Why would he? He returned home and, quietly entering the hallway, heard a conversation between his mother-in-law and his wife. From the very first phrases, the conversation shocked and stunned him. He could hear his mother-in-law shouting from the kitchen. Senora Marissa was yelling at her daughter. "Have you lost your mind? What were you thinking, you idiot? How could you get pregnant by your lover?" Carlos felt frozen inside, cold sweat breaking out all over him. He didn't know what to do, intervene, walk in and ask, or at least reveal his presence. Regina was crying, judging by her voice. "Keep your voice down, Mom. Why don't you tell all the neighbors too, so Carlos can find out?" Regina sobbed. Both women were overflowing with emotions. It seemed that, barely managing to compose herself, Senora Marissa transitioned from shouting to expressing her outrage in a more moderate tone. "So, what are you going to do now? Have you thought about it?" "I haven't decided yet," came the voice of his wife from deeper within the apartment. There was a brief pause, presumably while the mother tried to process everything that had been said and assess how critical her daughter's reckless behavior had become. Everyone was silent, including Carlos, who stood frozen in the hallway by the front door. He, too, was trying to quickly decide what to do, how to proceed. Everything was happening so quickly and unexpectedly. He had almost resolved to enter the room, reveal his presence and knowledge, observe their reactions, and learn the details when he heard a phrase from his mother-in-law that made him stop in his tracks. "And your lover, this Enzo, what does he say?" Senora Marissa asked indignantly. Regina's sobs could be heard again, but Carlos was focused on the name of his wife's lover. "Enzo," Carlos thought frantically. "Which Enzo? Do I know him?" At that moment, the surgeon decided to listen to the rest of the conversation between mother and daughter, hoping they might reveal more. He already felt like a complete fool and didn't want to be duped again. Through sobs and tears, struggling to control her emotions, Regina finally responded to her mother's question. "I haven't talked to him yet. I'm afraid of how he will react." "Oh my God, what an idiot," her mother fumed, raising her voice. "Afraid now? But you weren't afraid to cheat and get pregnant, were you?" Clearly, the question was rhetorical, intended only to vent her anger and utter incomprehension of her daughter's behavior. It was unlikely that Senora Marissa condemned the cheating itself. More probably she condemned the foolish mistake of getting pregnant. Naturally, Regina had nothing to say in response, no defense. She understood well enough what she had done and that she was at fault. She didn't need her mother's comments to realize that. Senora Marissa, evidently considering the options for getting out of the situation, asked her daughter, "So, are you sure the father isn't your legally wedded half-wit?" Although Carlos knew his mother-in-law hated him, hearing how she referred to him behind his back nearly made him react, his fists clenched painfully tight. While he tried to come to terms with what he'd heard, Regina sighed deeply and replied, "I haven't let him touch me for over 2 months, and the pregnancy is 5 weeks along. It's absolutely impossible. I even remember the exact day we were careless." "Careless," her mother scoffed with disdain. "No need to dress up your stupidity with fancy words and epithets." After pausing briefly, Senora Marissa continued, as if thinking out loud. "Yes, you can't pin this on him. He's no fool, he's a doctor, after all. In this case, you can't trick him. We'll have to find another way out." Poor Carlos. What was he going through at that moment? From the moment he entered the apartment and heard Senora Marissa's first remark, he was frozen in place, stunned. He still couldn't fully comprehend that this was really happening, that it wasn't a joke or a prank. Of course, he knew their marriage was falling apart, that he and Regina were on the verge of divorce. He knew they wouldn't make it, wouldn't save their family, but this? He was in shock and horror simultaneously, unable to believe that his wife had cheated on him and even gotten pregnant by someone else. It was unthinkable, simply incomprehensible. He had thought Regina would never stoop to such vulgarity. But wasn't it disgusting for her? Why hide it all, lie, deceive? It humiliated her, too. Wouldn't it have been simpler to come to him honestly, say she had fallen out of love, and apologize? Why all these games behind his back? Of course, he would have let her go. He felt physically sick and even sticky from being dragged into this love triangle. The situation was utterly nauseating. Meanwhile, he could hear the sounds of the ongoing argument. Senora Marissa, rethinking what had been said, continued to scream and insult her daughter. Apparently, Regina couldn't take it anymore and shouted back at her mother. "I know it all myself. Why are you yelling? What's the point of this scandal? Will it change anything? Why are you insulting me, screaming at me? It's done. Then why did you even tell me?" Senora Marissa seemed taken aback. "Did you really think I'd react any differently?" Regina burst into terrible sobs again. She was crying uncontrollably, judging by the sounds reaching Carlos. He could barely hear Regina's words. She was hysterical and almost whispered, "Because I'm very scared, Mommy." Even a heart as hard as Senora Marissa's couldn't remain unmoved by her child's suffering. Seeing her daughter's genuine distress, she softened and rushed to comfort her. All right, dear, don't cry. Calm down now, we'll get through this." Her tone and voice changed, almost cooing. "Don't worry. Either you can still pass the baby off as your fools, or you can marry his boss if it works out. There are still options. Don't lose hope too soon. Senora Marissa's last phrase struck Carlos to the core. Marry the boss? So, his wife's lover, the mysterious Enzo, was his direct superior, the head of the surgical department. This news shocked him. It was unbelievable, like something out of a bad joke, but how could this be real life? Carlos frantically thought about what to do, how to handle these newly revealed circumstances. This complicated everything exponentially. The conversation in the kitchen had entered a different phase. The emotional intensity had lessened, and they were speaking more quietly now, in fragments that were hard to make out. At any moment, mother and daughter could leave the kitchen and find him standing in the hallway. He knew he wouldn't be able to feign ignorance or act as if he had just arrived. He didn't have such talents, and Carlos knew this well about himself. A decision had to be made. No matter how painful and upsetting the news, he tried to think rationally, keeping his mind cool, a professional habit. It boiled down to understanding that he essentially had two options. The first was to burst in and create a scene, the second was to leave and think things through more carefully. The second option was infuriating. Why should he behave like a spy, acting behind everyone's back? Was he guilty of anything? Had he cheated on his wife? He didn't want to feel like a character in a cheap melodrama, suffering in silence behind everyone's back. Why should he? What had he done to deserve this? All these objections were undoubtedly valid, but there was one catch. If his wife's lover weren't his boss, he wouldn't have hesitated to storm in and throw both women out of his house. Why delay? But the situation was too delicate. Carlos was ready to lose his wife. He had already lost her, but he wasn't ready to risk his career. He could change jobs, move to another city hospital, but his boss had certain connections and influence. No, he needed to take a pause. He didn't want to act rashly and regret it later. A complex operation requires preparation and a detailed plan, and this situation was no different. He needed to proceed cautiously, thinking ahead about the consequences and anticipate potential pitfalls. The rational and thoughtful surgeon didn't forget to grab the keys from his coat pocket, the reason he had returned in the first place, before leaving the apartment. He wasn't ready to make a decision yet, so it wasn't the time. Naturally, Carlos continued to dwell on what had happened all the way back to the hospital, replaying every word, tormenting himself. But as soon as he arrived at work, all thoughts of his personal life vanished from his mind. The day was incredibly busy, with no time to spare, an endless amount of work, leaving him not a single free moment. It was as if someone above was protecting him, redirecting his attention, forcing him to think about something else. In a way, he was even grateful for the hectic pace. It provided some psychological relief. Work was the best way for him to reset mentally, and today there was plenty of it. Not only were there scheduled surgeries, but they were also bringing in emergency patients. And what was there to do? He had to roll up his sleeves and work tirelessly. People needed his help immediately. There was no time for sentimentality. It was a huge blessing that not thinking about external matters during surgery was a habit long ingrained in him. From their very first practice, surgeons were warned, you can't get distracted under any circumstances, no matter what is happening. Focus only on the operating field, no extraneous thoughts. Automatism is a good thing, but can sometimes be detrimental. So everything that happened that morning was left far behind. Thoughts about it would occasionally arise, but they quickly vanished under the pressure of the tasks at hand. This abundance of work likely saved him. All the emotional turmoil dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. Now, there was just a problem to be solved, coldly and rationally. It wasn't until 8 p.m., hurrying to a meeting, that Carlos had his first coffee of the day. What more can be said? That's when the anxiety hit. It was to be expected. Today he would be looking at his immediate superior with completely different eyes. He had thought they had a good relationship, maybe even a friendly one, informally chatting and asking about each other's lives. Now it seemed ridiculous. No matter how hard he tried, Carlos couldn't take his eyes off Enzo, sitting at the head of the table, watching him closely. Thoughts raced through his mind, from the absurdity of comparing himself to his rival to the grotesque idea of standing up and publicly shaming him. It was all melancholic nonsense, of course. Carlos wasn't ready to act yet. He barely had time to think. But he couldn't help but ruminate, trying to find the key to understanding why they had treated him so deceitfully, betraying him. He trusted them. It infuriated him. If they had fallen in love, why not say it outright? Or was it just about passion and physicality? And how ironic that it was Carlos who had introduced Regina to his boss at the New Year's party. It was all so vile and disgusting. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by an elbow nudge from the colleague sitting next to him. Looking at his colleague in surprise, Carlos realized he was being shaken out of his reverie because the boss was addressing him. "What, Senor Carlos?" the boss smirked, "sleeping during a work meeting?" "Sorry," Carlos mumbled in response. "It's been a tough day." "I understand, it's been tough for everyone. Tell me, what about the report you were assigned? Is it ready? Tomorrow's the deadline. I was hoping to see it today." "Sorry, I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning," the surgeon replied quietly. "I expect it. Don't forget, we have strict deadlines, Carlos." Carlos actually had everything ready. He had planned to go to Senor Enzo's office today to submit the work. But in light of the morning's events, he had no desire to interact with his boss, to look him in the eye, or to talk to him. He preferred to hand it over tomorrow morning before the start of the workday, avoiding unnecessary discussions. This option seemed much more appealing. Carlos wanted to finish quickly and leave, not wanting to spend an extra minute near his boss. It provoked thoughts and new bouts of self-recrimination. But he couldn't just stand up and leave. During the meeting, a colleague received an urgent call from the reception. He was on duty, and Carlos almost volunteered to go in his place. If it wouldn't have raised suspicions and odd looks, he would have run. Anything was better than sitting and enduring this slow torture. What irritated him the most was that Enzo behaved as if nothing had happened. He was calm and composed, acting as if everything was normal. Carlos began to scold himself for his cowardice and lack of courage. He should have burst into the kitchen and confronted the scoundrel directly. Why was he tolerating this? Why hide that he knew everything? What was the point of all these efforts? What was he supposed to do now? These thoughts tormented Carlos. The worst part was that he had no answers. He felt like he was sitting at the broken remains of his life, not knowing what to do next. How should he proceed? Forget about Regina, but how vengeful and spiteful would Enzo turn out to be? Carlos had once thought he was a very reasonable person, albeit with some odd and unpleasant traits, but decent. Now, how could he predict his behavior? It was an interesting situation. The boss steals the wife, and the subordinate fears for his career. Where is the justice? Where? Is there any justice in this world at all? The surgeon wondered. Stupidly, he knew better than anyone that there was no such thing as justice in the world. Just the other day, during his shift, they brought in a driver who caused a car accident. He survived, but the family he crashed into didn't. They all died despite the doctor's best efforts. So what could be said about his own trivial troubles? Lost in these thoughts, the meeting finally ended. Carlos realized then that he wouldn't go home tonight. He'd sleep in his office. He didn't want to see Regina, let alone his mother-in-law. He wasn't in the state to look them in the eye and watch the charade, knowing the truth. It was terrifying to imagine how he would react with his new knowledge if his wife started another argument, asserting her rights and making demands. No, it was better to preserve his already fragile nerves. Sleeping on an uncomfortable couch was far better. For the sake of formality, Carlos texted Regina, "I won't be home tonight. I have an urgent report to finish." Immediately after sending it, he turned off his phone's sound. He knew this message would enrage his wife, triggering a storm of emotions, and he didn't want to listen to or read her latest hysterics. He'd deal with it in the morning. Fortunately, Carlos could afford to ignore his phone for the night. A colleague was on duty now, and Enzo would be taking over the shift in the morning, so the boss would be at the hospital. It was wise to stock up on provisions to avoid wandering around the corridors at night and potentially running into Enzo. Being alone with him could lead to an awkward friendly chat, which was the last thing Carlos wanted. Every patient has its limit. Having prepared everything he needed, he felt he had covered all bases and sat down to work on patient records, organizing documents, and making notes. This routine work often got neglected, so it was a good opportunity to catch up on it. However, Carlos's thoughts kept drifting back to his wife and his boss. Who could blame him? It was too significant a blow to simply erase from his mind and heart. After struggling until 4 a.m. and completing about a third of his ambitious plan, Carlos decided to go to bed. After all, he had a workday ahead, with surgeries, consultations, and other responsibilities. Amazingly, he began to drift off. It wasn't a peaceful, relaxed state. Instead, he fell into a troubled, dark, and grim nightmare, but at least he wasn't suffering from insomnia. Carlos was jolted awake by a terrible scream, first faint and distant, then right next to him. A woman was shouting something incomprehensible, or perhaps he was too groggy to understand. Someone was banging furiously on his office door. After a few seconds, shaking off the heavy sleep, Carlos finally realized where he was and what was happening. He recognized the voice of the shouting woman. It was Isabella Silvero, the head nurse on duty. Her voice didn't cease. Carlos, the nurse gasped, either from panic, fear, or exhausting running up and down the floors. Are you here? Please, the light's on. Indeed, he had fallen asleep with the desk lamp still on. What happened? He reluctantly responded. Naturally, Carlos understood that such a distressed and panicked voice from an experienced nurse, who had seen a lot, signaled a disaster of global proportions. He didn't want to get involved in problems, but Isabella was pressing too hard. Please, come quickly. There's a crisis. Help, please. What else could he do? By responding, he had already committed himself. He hastily unlocked his office door and hurried after the nurse. Seeing Isabella, he realized it was even worse than he could have imagined. No matter what had happened before, he had never seen the nurse in such a state. Her hands were shaking, her face was pale, and cold sweat was on her forehead. Given that Isabella was in surgical scrubs, there was no doubt something had happened in the operating room. Unable to guess what it might be, he rushed there as quickly as possible. He knew trying to get information from the shaken nurse would be futile and time-consuming. They had already lost too much time searching for him and waking him up. He needed to see for himself, on site. As Carlos rushed down the stairs faster than taking the elevator, his mind raced with hundreds of guesses, each more horrific than the last. The most dreadful thoughts competed for prominence in his head, but what he saw still shook him to an unimaginable degree. The entire floor of the operating room was drenched in blood. Although not uncommon with severe injuries, something about this scene disturbed Carlos. It seemed that all the blood transfused into the patient had also ended up on the floor. Blood was gushing from the poor soul. The life support machine showed zero activity. While it was clear that no one could survive such a situation, the anesthesiologist, the surgical nurse, and everyone else stood with stone faces, filled with fear and panic. One person, however, seemed unaffected. Enzo continued working in the operating field, oblivious to the fact that the patient had long since died. Carlos moved towards his boss on unsteady legs. His initial assumption was correct. His wife's lover was monstrously drunk. Without saying a word, Carlos bent over the patient, closely observing his boss's actions. Sadly, it was clear without words, the patient had been butchered. Enzo, in his drunken state, had wreaked havoc. He had slashed arteries and veins. Every blood vessel near the surgical site was a mess. It seemed as though a drunken butcher, not a surgeon, had been at work. Even in such a state, it took effort to cause such damage to a living person. The unfortunate patient had clearly come in with a simple case of acute appendicitis, with a risk of rupture, prompting the call for the on-duty surgeon. They had called to their doom. Enzo, take your hands off the patient. He is dead, Carlos said firmly. Who are you to order me around? The chief slurred angrily. If you don't stop, I will use force, Carlos insisted. Apparently, Carlos's determination unsettled the head of the department. He carefully, as best as his drunken state allowed, placed the scalpel down and lowered his hands, staring silently at Carlos. But Carlos was no longer addressing him. Why didn't anyone stop him? Why? How did you let this happen? The anesthesiologist, the surgical nurse, and Isabella, who had arrived shortly after, all looked down, remaining silent. Unlike the thoroughly drunk Enzo, they understood the gravity of what had happened and the consequences they faced. Speak up already. How did this happen? Carlos shouted again, unable to bear the tense silence. The surgical nurse, pressed against the wall in terror, began to stammer in a thin, breaking voice. He said he'd fire us all, that he was the god of surgery, that what was a little appendix to him, that he could remove it with his eyes closed. Carlos took a deep breath, struggling to contain his fury and despair. The room reeked of alcohol and blood, a nauseating combination that matched the chaos before him. He knew he had to act swiftly and decisively to salvage whatever he could from this catastrophic situation. Unfortunately, this behavior was very typical of the boss when he'd been drinking. Sober, he was a normal person, but as soon as he had a drink, his arrogance skyrocketed, and he lost all sense of danger and self-preservation almost instantly. What could we have done? He's the senior member of the surgical team, the only head of the department. The anesthesiologist raised his voice. It was clear he had chosen the tactic of the best defense is a good offense. Behind this facade, his shock was evident. Of course, no one had imagined that this time a surgery with a drunken surgeon would end in tragedy. Unfortunately, it had happened periodically, and so far, everyone had gotten away with it. As long as the patient survived, there were no investigations. As soon as we saw what he was doing, I ran for help, but it was too late, Isabella couldn't resist adding. Too late, Carlos repeated automatically. He frantically tried to figure out the right course of action. He realized he was the only one maintaining relative calm and capable of thinking rationally. All right, Carlos spoke quickly, lock Enzo in an office. Call security to escort him. Not his office, make sure he has no means of communication with him. Isabella, call the police and the chief. Everyone present immediately turned against him, a chorus of voices expressing dissatisfaction. The boss was outraged that a subordinate had taken it upon himself to give orders. The anesthesiologist was also furious that Carlos had assumed authority. The surgical nurse was wailing and even started crying. Isabella was shocked at the idea of calling the police. It was strange. How did she think this would be handled? Did they really think they could cover it up? Everyone shut up. Enzo, especially you, or I swear to God I'll hit you, Carlos shouted in a voice that didn't sound like his own. This command immediately silenced everyone. What's unclear? Isabella, why are you standing there? The woman still stood in the doorway, not daring to move. Her eyes were wide. Call the police? Are you sure? Where else? Now, and no arguments, Carlos demanded. Apparently, he was very convincing in this role, as everyone quickly gave in and began to carry out his orders. Isabella left to call security to isolate Enzo and to contact the police and the chief doctor. Carlos turned to the others. Let's get this place cleaned up and preserve any evidence. We need to make sure everything is documented properly for the investigation. We can't afford to make any mistakes now. He began to organize the staff, ensuring that they all had specific tasks to help manage the situation. Despite the chaos and his own turmoil, Carlos knew that the only way to get through this was to stay focused and take control. All right, Miguel, he addressed the anesthesiologist, you need to sit separately for now and don't talk to anyone. Yolanda, you too. The surgical nurse nodded meekly and retreated, but the anesthesiologist wasn't ready to give in. Who put you in charge? What do you think of yourself? He protested. Carlos's eyes filled with anger, and his voice dropped to a near bass, becoming deep and resonant. Don't even think about arguing with me. You've already made a mess here. A person is dead. Do you realize the consequences for all of you? You'll all go to jail. How could you let a drunk idiot near the operating table? He can't even stand straight. Miguel's defiance quickly deflated. The spirit of competition and contradiction vanished. I'll be in the break room, he muttered reluctantly and left, casting a highly dissatisfied look at Carlos. Carlos was left alone with Enzo. Enzo seemed utterly clueless about what was happening, his dull, uncomprehending gaze shifting from the patient to the instruments to his subordinate. He even tried to engage in dialogue, asking questions, but Carlos ignored him. What was the point of explaining anything to someone who barely knew his own name? He just had to wait for the security guards to arrive, take Enzo away, and lock him up to prevent any further damage. Once Carlos ensured that Enzo, Miguel, and Yolanda were isolated and that the police had been called, he sat in the main foyer, waiting. He wondered who would arrive first, the chief doctor or the police, and who he would have to explain to first. He needed to maintain his composure and not succumb to stress. The day had been extremely eventful since the morning before. Who could have predicted such a drastic turn of events? How could life flip so dramatically? Carlos couldn't stop thinking about one thing. If not for that fateful morning, which had been just over 20 hours ago, would he have acted the same way? What if he had remained blissfully ignorant of the relationship between his boss and his wife, unaware of her pregnancy by Enzo? Would he have done the same? Nothing would have changed, right? Wouldn't he have tried to cover for his boss out of a misplaced sense of duty? He wanted to believe in himself as a decent person, but honestly, Carlos wasn't sure. Everything changed when his view of his boss changed. Moreover, Carlos was convinced that Enzo had gotten drunk to such a piggish state for a reason. He must have found out about Regina's pregnancy. That didn't excuse him, of course. As he sat alone, Carlos tried to understand whether he was a good or bad person. He was deeply troubled by the connection between the morning's and night's events. It's a pity that history doesn't tolerate the subjunctive mood. No one will ever know what might have happened if a certain event or circumstance were erased. Carlos knew that the only way to remain a decent person in this situation, to retain his self-respect, was to hand his boss over to the authorities and let them handle it. But would he have done so if he didn't know that Enzo, the drunken surgeon and clear cause of the patient's death, was his wife's lover? If he had thought of Enzo only as his boss, colleague, mentor, and a decent guy? These moral dilemmas were a serious test for the surgeon, and he also felt deeply sorry for the patient who died for no reason, having come in with such a simple issue and ending up like this. It was a tragedy for all of the patient's relatives and loved ones. Carlos was snapped out of his sad thoughts when the disheveled chief doctor burst into the hospital building. Such speed was to be expected, he lived in the neighboring house. Roberto Cornelio rushed toward the surgeon without slowing down. "What the hell?" the chief doctor shouted. Noticing that a few visitors were turning to look at him, he lowered his voice but still hissed with tension. "You should have called me first, consulted with me. What do you think you're doing? Who gave you the right to take charge?" To be honest, Carlos had no doubt that this would be the reaction. The chief doctor would be furious. Naturally, his priority was to protect the hospital's reputation, maintain the appearance of legality, and cover up the crime if possible. But Carlos had cut off all his avenues for retreat, provoking anger and aggression from the higher-ups. Yet Carlos knew he was in the right and had no intention of backing down. Not a single muscle twitched on his face. "I did what was necessary. You didn't see the state Enzo and the patient were in. What he did to him is unimaginable." "Exactly," Roberto shouted again. "I should have seen it and confirmed it." Carlos thought to himself, yes, confirm that there is nothing to be done to cover for the drunken surgeon. But aloud he said, "Reporting a crime is my civic duty and responsibility. I'm not going to neglect it." The chief doctor was infuriated by the surgeon's tone. He was about to launch into another angry tirade, which would undoubtedly have contained a fair amount of insults, but fortunately, the police officers finally arrived. Roberto had to pull himself together and go with them to assess the situation and offer his assistance. However, he shot Carlos a look that clearly conveyed, "This isn't over yet." But Carlos didn't care. He didn't feel guilty, in fact, quite the opposite. These past 24 hours had been the strangest of his life. Morning, day, night, and now early morning, all were filled with various surprises and emotional shocks. The officers began their investigation, and Carlos knew he had done the right thing. The truth would come out, and justice would be served. No matter the consequences, he had acted with integrity, and that gave him a sense of peace amidst the chaos. Carlos felt like he had repeated everything he knew 100 times. He had to recount the events again and again for various people in uniform and plain clothes, being asked even the most insignificant details. The police officers and investigators were interested in everything, asking him to repeat even the details of yesterday's meeting. They were questioning all the staff who were at the hospital and had even the slightest connection to the incident. Moreover, all the surgery staff and Enzo's subordinates were summoned. The police were interested in every detail of the chief's life. Maybe someone had noticed any oddities recently. The thoroughness was astonishing. In his line of work, Carlos had been questioned before in various situations where law enforcement was involved. There had been complaints, reports, and routine inspections. He was well versed in dealing with people in uniform. This is why he was very surprised by the thoroughness with which they approached the case this time. He couldn't resist asking during another round of questioning, "Can you tell me why you're so rigorously pursuing this case?" "Sorry, but I know the usual procedure." "It's tragic, but..." "Don't you know who the deceased was, whose son he was?" the officer interrupted him. Of course, Carlos didn't know and couldn't even guess. He shook his head in surprise. The man who died on the operating table was the son of the deputy mayor of the city, Senor Juan, the officer replied wearily. And suddenly, everything made sense. The police had to thoroughly investigate the death of the patient to determine whether it was an accident, a criminal act of drunken negligence, or cold-blooded murder. At that moment, Carlos realized that there was no way Enzo would get out of this. He would be imprisoned. It was dreadful to think that all the other staff involved in the operation might also be caught up in the fallout. They weren't saints, but it was a pity. They were only following orders, even if they were criminally negligent. Carlos felt a sense of relief in knowing that he felt no joy, no schadenfreude. On the contrary, he was very depressed by the whole situation. But everything seemed fair and just from a karmic standpoint. Enzo had lied his way through life, and now he was paying the price. One shouldn't play with luck. Alcohol is a common vice among many doctors, but it had once again destroyed a talented physician. It was bitter and sad. No matter what, Enzo did have skillful hands and talent, but Carlos preferred not to think about the man's moral character. Fortunately, it wasn't his place to judge. Although, it was clear that during the thorough investigation, the authorities would likely find out about Enzo's affair with Regina. This meant there was an indirect connection between Carlos and his boss. It looked particularly acute given that Carlos was the one who reported Enzo. How fortunate that no living soul knew Carlos was aware of his wife's infidelity. That would have complicated matters greatly. In addition to endless interactions with various authorities, Carlos had to perform 2 emergency surgeries. What else could he do? Patients couldn't be asked to wait. They couldn't be told that the on-duty surgeon was in handcuffs answering an investigator's questions. As he was getting ready to go home, utterly exhausted, Carlos decided to find out all the details from the talkative staff. He knew the nosy nurses and was sure they had already sniffed out and discussed everything. He cunningly sneaked into the nurses' station with a pack of cookies and asked for news. "Girls, could you share what you found out? I'm very curious." He smiled slyly. 2 young nurses, Antonia and Vina, began recounting everything they knew about the incident, competing to outdo each other. He must have been on a date, got drunk to the point of seeing green devils, the bastard, Antonia fumed, furrowing her brow. And what makes you think that? Carlos asked, intrigued. Her friend interrupted. You should have seen how he was dressed up, all perfumed. Definitely for a woman, where else? In this part, Carlos wasn't surprised, it was just as he had suspected. Of course, Enzo had come from an urgent call from Regina. Why not? Carlos had told his boss he needed to finish the report and would submit it tomorrow. He had told his wife the same thing, so his actions had essentially given the lovers carte blanche. Vina continued to chatter on. That's when they called him, when they brought the patient in by ambulance. He arrived quickly but was terribly displeased and drunk, awfully drunk. Antonia didn't want to be left out and decided to add to the story. Yes, drunk. But I think he might have drunk more before going into surgery. This question was more rhetorical, but Carlos pondered it. If things were as he thought, if Regina had told Enzo about her pregnancy that evening, Enzo might have been trying to relieve his stress. Why not? He could have had more to drink. And who let him into the operating room? Vina exclaimed indignantly. Yeah, you try to stop him, Antonia shot back, glaring at her friend. You know how many times he's operated while pretty drunk, just shouting and giving orders. Not like you, Carlos, the second nurse took the opportunity to flatter him. Carlos listened intently, absorbing the details. The situation was even more chaotic than he had initially thought. But now he had a fuller picture of what had transpired. As much as the flattery was appreciated, it didn't change the gravity of the situation or the consequences everyone involved would face. He listened to their chatter half-heartedly. Carlos was trying to piece together a coherent picture of what had happened the previous evening. It seemed to be coming together. He knew the most important details. Do you know how angry Senor Roberto is with you? Antonia asked. He was yelling at everyone, saying they shouldn't have listened to you, shouldn't have called the police. Yes, he already expressed that to me personally, the surgeon didn't hide. He wondered how Roberto intended to cover up what had happened, especially considering the deceased patient's identity. The nurses exchanged glances and shrugged. We're just worried about you. Everyone thinks you did the right thing. Enzo has been getting more and more arrogant lately. This was bound to happen, Vina shared. Carlos thought to himself, I wonder how disappointed they would be in me if they knew about the secret affair between Enzo and Regina. It discredited his actions even in his own eyes, let alone in the eyes of others. They would likely see it as an act of pettiness. I also think I did the right thing, he forced a smile. All right, girls, take care. I'm heading home. After warmly bidding farewell to the staff he encountered on his way out, Carlos hurried home. Everyone he met gave him unusually wide smiles. He saw that in their eyes, he had become almost a hero. This made him feel nauseous, causing him to question more and more whether his actions had been impartial. The question hung in the air, an unspoken reproach. Whatever the case, it was time to head home and talk to his wife. Carlos mentally prepared himself for a difficult conversation. But it didn't happen. Just as he was about to leave the hospital, another police officer stopped him and asked him to come to the investigation department. Carlos's patience was running thin, and he was tired of repeating the same thing over and over. He couldn't hold back. Seriously? Listen, I'm exhausted. Can't this wait? The police officer responded in a tone that brooked no argument. That's the procedure. Sorry. What could he say? He had to comply. Carlos also feared that in the next conversation with the investigators, the fact that his wife was the suspect's lover might come up. He would have to manage his emotions somehow. Could he pull it off? The surgeon knew he wasn't good at pretending. But fortunately, this fact hadn't come to the investigators' attention yet, or they had decided to hold on to that information. In any case, Carlos wasn't asked anything new. It was the same questions over and over again. Accordingly, Carlos's answers remained unchanged. Why should they? He hadn't spoken a single word of falsehood. Tell me, will I have to go through this many more times? To be honest, it's starting to get tiresome, the surgeon said. The investigator, a man about Carlos's age, smiled. You know who the patient was. All the higher-ups are demanding swift action to identify the guilty parties, no matter what. Well, there's nothing new to say, Carlos was puzzled. The investigator just shrugged. My superiors ordered me to recheck all the statements, so I'm rechecking. Although the guilty party has already come to his senses and confessed. Well, it would be strange to deny it, the surgeon nodded. Carlos was finally freed by lunchtime. Half the day wasted. Naturally, when he finally got home, Regina wasn't there. She had long gone to work. Perhaps it was for the best, he would have some time to sleep. He also needed to think carefully about how to approach the conversation with Regina, what to say, and how to be cautious. At the usual time, he heard the rustling at the front door. He hadn't slept, just listened. Finally, his wife arrived. Regina managed to enter and go to the kitchen when her husband, exhausted, came out of the bedroom. Carlos stood in the doorway, looking at her with poorly concealed contempt, though she either didn't notice or pretended not to. Oh, she said, you're home? I'm surprised. You didn't reply yesterday or later either. Was it that difficult? Regina was not backing down and seemed ready to start another storm in a teacup. This manner of communication convinced Carlos that she knew nothing about what had happened. Well, all the better. Why? He asked. Your lover told you that I had a report confirming my whereabouts. Regina's eyes widened in amazement and shock. Naturally, she was surprised that her husband knew about the lover and the infidelity, but she pretended not to understand what he was talking about, though she was clearly frightened. It was noticeable. What? What lover? What are you talking about? Her voice even wavered a bit. Sorry, the man responded wearily, I don't have the energy for pleasantries, so I'll be very brief. I have 3 pieces of news for you. First, and most importantly, I know you've been cheating on me with Enzo, my boss. Regina sat down in surprise. Everything that was happening was clearly not part of her plans. She wasn't prepared and even tried to pretend she felt unwell. This act by his wife didn't convince Carlos at all. He continued his prepared speech. Second, I know about your pregnancy and that the child isn't mine. You had to see the expression on Regina's face. Her emotions were changing at the speed of a subliminal frame, probably barely keeping up with her thoughts. She was obviously trying to figure out where she had slipped up and how to get out of this situation. Should she deny everything or confess and beg for forgiveness? But her husband was relentless. And third, this is more news for you than for me. I'm guessing Enzo isn't responding to you. You're probably worried about that. You told him about the baby, and now you think he's just dumped you? Regina remained silent, but shot a look at her husband full of anger and hatred. It was clear that he had hit the mark with his conclusions. Well, Enzo isn't answering because he's in a detention cell. He rushed from your love rendezvous to the operation already drunk. Right? And added more due to stress. I won't burden you with unnecessary details, I've had enough of them today. I'll just say one thing, the patient died, and Enzo is 100% responsible for it. So, sorry, but your lover is going to jail. You don't have to believe me, but I truly regret that it turned out this way. As soon as Regina heard this news, she started sobbing uncontrollably. Carlos felt he had never seen his wife in such a state before. Maybe Enzo did love her, or maybe it was all because of the pregnancy and hormones. Although the most likely scenario, as cynical as it sounds, seemed to be that she felt sorry for herself. Yes, it was a pitiable situation, indeed. Her hysteria went on for about 10 minutes. She wouldn't stop, just kept sobbing. Carlos's nerves couldn't take it any longer. Sorry, but I don't have the time or energy to listen to your hysterics. I'm not going to pity you. Please, pack up and leave. That's when his wife finally reacted. She looked at him with a bewildered expression. You want to throw me out of the house? She was shocked even at the suggestion. What did you expect? This apartment is mine, inherited from my grandmother, so you have no legal claim to it. I suggest you pack up and go to Senora Marissa's as soon as possible. I'm sure she'll be happy to have her beloved daughter. He didn't feel proud of himself now. He had let his emotions get the better of him, overstepped the mark when he had wanted to remain detached. In Carlos's view, his wife should have quietly submitted. How else could it be? She was backed into a corner. Her husband knew about the affair and the child from her lover. His intellectual notions about life didn't align at all with Regina's. She thought she could ask for forgiveness and be forgiven. Unthinkable. How can you treat me like this? His wife began to wail. Have mercy on me, forgive me. Yes, I stumbled, but... He couldn't believe his ears. He didn't even want to listen to this nonsense. It was unbearable. Enough, he interrupted her. Carlos spoke quietly and calmly. Save this performance for your mother. It's too late to play games with me. Carlos, my love, please give me another chance. I'm begging you, don't leave me. Can't you see what situation I'm in now? Regina, he interrupted her again, strictly but calmly, we both know our marriage didn't turn out well. You could have just left, that would have been understandable, but you chose to betray. Yes, I was foolish, forgive me, she broke into tears, I'm such an idiot. I'm just amazed at how much you think I'm a fool. Do you really think I'll forgive you, keep quiet, smile, and raise a child you had with someone else? And on top of that, listen to your complaints and scandals again and again? It's beyond any limits. Overwhelmed with emotion, he threw up his hands. At that moment, Regina clearly saw that it was over. No matter what she did, no matter how much she begged for mercy, no matter how much she groveled at his feet, nothing would help. It was the end, his patience had run out. The calmness, even tone, and weariness in his eyes greatly influenced her final decision. There was nothing left to do but pack her things and leave, which she did. The last 3 hours alone with his wife were a trial for Carlos, but it was worth it. Finally, he was alone. The feeling of freedom was intoxicating, and there were no regrets. It seemed that life was improving, that he could finally breathe again. But the next day at work, Carlos was met with a very unpleasant surprise. The chief doctor called him in for a debriefing. Roberto was shouting. How could you? What were you thinking? You should have called me first, asked how to proceed. You should have called me first, not the police. The surgeon's nervous system had grown tired of resisting endless stress, and in an unwise moment, he blurted out. And what would have changed? Would you have hidden the body? That was a mistake. Roberto shouted so loudly that several floors above and below could hear him. The outcome was obvious. The chief doctor forced him to write a resignation letter if he didn't want any trouble at work. Of course, he could have refused categorically. But how would that help? To sue the hospital, fight the chief doctor's decision, ruin his reputation, and worse, continue working under this madman, who needed that? It was clear that with such an attitude from the leadership, his career was over. No, Carlos signed everything required of him, agreeing to leave by mutual consent, and left that very day. It was somewhat bitter to part with the staff, who were mostly good people and professionals, but so be it. Carlos tried to take it philosophically, not to get upset or grieve unnecessarily. There would be another job, better than the previous one. After all, this period meant renewal. It was foolish to mourn the past, which couldn't be changed. What happened, happened. No matter what, Carlos didn't regret how he had acted. Enzo had committed a crime and had to answer for it by law. Carlos's life during this period made astonishing twists and turns. He barely had time to adapt before everything changed again drastically. It was impossible to even understand in which direction these changes were heading, for better or worse. The next week after all the events, the surgeon spent lying on the couch. It had been a long time since he had rested both body and soul like this. Finally, there was no need to rush anywhere, no deadlines, no one nagging him. It was bliss. This was something to dream about. A week later, he received a call. A smooth male voice asked him to come to the hospital at a certain time. Honestly, Carlos didn't think much of it. He assumed he needed to finalize some paperwork, collect remaining documents, or his personal file, typical bureaucratic stuff related to his resignation. But it turned out that in that short time, everything at the hospital had changed. Senor Roberto had been removed from his position, and a new chief doctor had been appointed. This new chief, Senor Danilo, quickly understood how and why Carlos had been fired. The new chief doctor, Senor Danilo, said to Carlos without beating around the bush, "Unlike my predecessor, I very much appreciate such behavior and honesty from employees. I'd like to invite you back to work. Moreover, we have an open position for the head of the surgical department. How do you feel about my offer?" "I'd be delighted," Carlos replied with pleasure. "Indeed, why would he refuse?" "Excellent. Please begin your duties starting tomorrow," the chief doctor smiled. What an unexpected 180 degrees turn. How could anyone predict where they'd find fortune or loss? Carlos couldn't have imagined such a generous offer even in his wildest dreams. Everything that had happened in this short period clearly demonstrated one thing: there is a balance of good and evil in life, and you must never despair or lose hope because you never know how fate will turn. Out of something bad, good can emerge, and vice versa. The key, perhaps, is to never lose hope, to do what is right, and to hope for the best. That is the recipe and the secret to happiness. Now Carlos hopes that, in addition to his career, he will soon have luck in his personal life as well. He wants to find his soulmate, to discover that bright and genuine feeling.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.